One question that is normally on everyone's lips and usually resides somewhere in their minds is, what were the first beliefs? I nearly always provide an answer that covers mainly animism, the principle that all things have spirit, but there's a lot more than this, and inasmuch as we can't conclusively say they believed in this or that, we can deduce a number of ideas they had from the lifestyle, geography and geology, alongside cave art and artifacts. So, in order to answer this question, I'll explain what we believe we know, as nothing is set in concrete. As always, there is a compelling surge to the multi-layered text of Genesis, which I will explain. The text of the relevant passage is below. What did they believe? Well, when we posit an idea regarding this, it generally comes from the notion that spirituality is a uniquely human thing, yet it is not. Other hominids have had systems of thought that merged with ours. It may seem odd, but it's very compelling, when one considers some of the oldest markings and drawings with what or whom was about at that time, as it precedes human activity. Developed Cro-Magnon, Devisonian and Neanderthal hominids had what are described as cultures, these being not a literal culture but a style or trend that is very evident at that related time. This idea of culture permeated through to Homo sapiens, who again developed styles of art or pottery, techniques for knapping flint, making tools, etc. These cultures preceded civilized settlements, but the areas they cover lead rather nicely to where civilization eventually emerges. From archaeology and studying the history of geology and geography, we can piece evidence together that helps us understand their environment, as this heavily influenced what they believed. Now, not all beliefs were the same. In fact, many are pretty diverse, but essentially the underlying principle was the same, that they and nature, moreover everything, is interconnected. This, when combined with observations of cave art and markings, like geoglyphs or petroglyphs, tell us lots. I'll explain. Early cave art details animals and plants, not people, as this developed later, and people worked as a unit, not as individuals, and understood that they were part of a bigger thing, the whole. We believe that they had a collective mindset, as identity hadn't fully developed as a concept in our consciousness. Yet, we were conscious of how everything was entwined and related. As an example, when an area was affected by a drought, fauna moved to where there was abundance, so to live, and others would follow the natural pattern, the natural ebb and flow of tides, seasons, and later, the stars. It was simple observation and observed relationships. When an area was visited that was abundant, markers were left, indicating what was on the menu, being richly available in the area. This is what is currently the baseline for their beliefs. On top of this, we have animism, the understanding that all things, everything, is living. Rocks, trees, animals, plants, mountains, absolutely everything. This living is encapsulated in the concept of spirit. How they discerned this is up for debate, yet it is my firm, personal opinion that believes it is due to observing shadows. When one looks at some, not all, of the very oldest depictions of people, they have no detail, look a bit like stick men, and some are elongated at peculiar angles. I'm suggesting that the presence of the shadow was understood, or misunderstood possibly, as being directly related to the environment and the sun, as all things have a shadow. When one is alive, the shadow is present on the ground, and when one has passed on, their shadow is in the ground. The ubiquitous sun was seen as an integral part of existence. The earliest beliefs suggest that they perceived that they came and went to nowhere, but this idea is not literally nowhere, for it's another place. Where and what it is, was explored a lot later on. The shadow was an intrinsic part of them and hence, gave rise to the concept of spirit, and it further cements the idea of oneness as well. Like I said, we don't know what or why they comprehended, yet logically this would make simple, common sense. The basic principle of early belief was therefore interconnectedness and having a spirit. The way differences would have occurred is through travel and meeting others, known as syncresis. At the earliest points of hominid history there were two types of society, those who frequented the mountains and those who stayed at land, sea level. However, the majority went everywhere and tended to stay higher up, due to geological events and processes. Volcanic eruptions, Earthquakes, tsunamis, and floods meant that they quickly learned to live above the sea level. Evidence of this is seen across the planet, and wherever there's a gap in the rocks, if you can get through, then they did, for they tended to leave their marks. I have seen modern-day investigators travel to remote areas in canyons, valleys and mountains and think, that's remote, can I get to it? Then find a way to it, and once there, discover markings or other evidence of others having been there before, and this happens a lot. It's nearly always higher up, so elevated areas were the norm for the majority. What people frequently forget is that our ancestors constantly traveled, not just settling in one area, but traveled back and forth according to the seasonal route, plus they traveled in groups, not huge groups, but a size large enough to be called a tribe. There were some though who stayed at sea level, and these explored the islands that started to emerge in the Far East, when the area between China and Australia began to be reclaimed by the seas. We don't know how they traveled over the water, but they did, and before the Ice Age, the sea level was significantly lower, between 120 to 150 m lower, which encouraged migration beyond New Zealand up to the southern Pacific Islands and then across to South America. The coastal region of Antarctica was also touched on at one time, but they knew it was no good living there. Others migrated along the shoreline to the North Pacific and over Beringia to Northern America. Collectively we had mountain dwellers and lowlanders. It was the mountain dwellers that developed markings, but the lowlanders tended to use geoglyphs instead, a distinct type of marking. The beliefs of each were pretty much the same, save societal differences. The environment helped form their later beliefs, for what was abundant in that location often became the god. If corn was evident, a corn god is observed. If fish are plentiful, a fish god is evident, etc. The other side of the environmental calculation is rocks themselves. Many rock types have naturally occurring geometry. With time, they worked rock before wood and metal. Huge monolith and blocks can be separated from the cliff by inserting wooden lengths in the gaps and then relying on the combination of expansion and contraction of the wood to prise the block apart. It not only kept dodgy cliffs safer, but later on they utilized the large blocks and monoliths for various tasks. The natural geometry led them to eventually build and construct things, which means that they would evolve a system of numbers, mathematics, and toolmaking, as both are needed to construct. The same equivalent is noticed with lowlanders in very early constructions of banks and hydrological systems, so to work with the seas. These concepts of numbers and construction helped develop cognition, and as we evolved. As we wandered about, we would meet other groups and share ideas, so similar concepts pop up across the globe that cause us to think, how did they have the same knowledge as someone on the other side of the world? Again, syncresis is the cause. So where are we then? We have our baseline beliefs, we understand that they moved about and developed ways of marking rock and land, started learning about geometry and maths. What next? Medicine and care. The time came when people started to care and try using plants and whatnot to cure. It was primarily trial and error, but over time more species could be identified as good for healing, as well as good for eating. One of the most fascinating concepts that I learnt is about leaching, where harmful plants can be purified of poison in water. In one instance, a root is dug up and in order to eat it, it needs to be leached, so they made a small dam in the body of water, leached the roots in the stream, as well as catching the fish, who had been poisoned, thus dead. Ingenious, and this was before we could even write. Cultural evidence from tribes shows these methods are still used today. The fish were edible by the way, but to leach a poison from a root rendering it edible, as well poison fish in the process, meaning that you had two forms of food for a meal, is absolutely amazing, I think. They learned how to use poison for hunting. To reiterate, with time they developed medicine in a similar way, and when they did start to care, big changes happened, because they were thinking more, in different ways. In a very pragmatic sense, caring involves thinking about the elderly and young, and an individual's ability to perform in a group is compromised if they're not healthy, so the idea of individuality emerged. As this happened, types of people were noticed. Roles started appearing for those of various talents. The ones who knew about medicine became known as, one who knows, in other words, a shaman. Some call them witch doctors, but the proper term is a shaman. Eventually, in civilized society, these shamans became apothecaries, doctors and priests, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's through the ones who know that we start to notice roles in tribes. Skill sets ended up being more diverse, so you get storytellers, chiefs, artists, toolmakers, etc. Society was forming. The tribal customs vary according to where you are, so beliefs are different, but the underlying principles are there, everywhere. Medicine, mathematics and geology helped shape society, long before we became civilized. Then everything changes and civilization emerges, but how and why? The answer lies in the Ice Ages. From what we can gather, people were just beginning to get to grips with the idea of relocating plants. There are such things as forest gardens, which whilst naturally abundant, some have evidence of non-native species amongst them. Some of them would have been relocated due to feces retaining seeds, and in this way, fecal deposits encouraged the spreading out of some flora. Others, though, we believe, were deliberately replanted due to the need to keep favored fruits from a different location in a convenient place. However, just as this was happening, the Ice Age started. As the landscape changed, so did their eating habits. The traditional routes they had been traveling began to be hindered due to the colder environment, so alternatives were used. As they rolled with the changes, new sources of food were discovered, including eating more meat and seafood. The challenges were not sudden but gradual and put a stop to relocating plants and early attempts at farming. And things stayed this way for a long time. Due to these collective challenges, the issue of care was heightened, and this was the catalyst for what happens next. As the Ice Age tightened its grip, decisions needed to be made regarding the elderly and young, so the idea of settling emerged. They continued to hunt and gather food, but not all of them would go on the hunt. It's at this point that people remained relatively local to a specific area, moving on if resources became scarce and setting up a new settlement. As the Ice Age started to ease and the situation improved, the idea of settlements increased. With this came the need for storage. You have to remember that they'd just endured a serious event, so storage was heavily on their minds. So the principles of hunter-gathering began to adapt. Typically, there were several small communities that stayed local to an area, with shared communal facilities being the center. This is when the first henges and teepees appear. They were regional centers for meetings, services and spectator events, plus if necessary, they could be used for storage. If one became no longer useful, it would be either taken down or filled in. Predominantly, though, the structures were built for reuse, so the wooden structures were replaced with large stones and monoliths. Whereas hunter-gatherers used to leave markers and signs of local foods, those indicators were carved into the stones and monoliths of the teepees. The idea was that you would build a solid structure, then cover it with a roof and walls of branches, leaves, wood, etc., being able to replace or remove the parts as required, yet more importantly, it could be reused by another community if they left and another came along. The ethos of the egalitarianism remained as their behavior changed towards settling down. The egalitarian way of life, which is very evident in hunter-gathering, survived and adapted to having a tribal home, a regional hub, and still go hunting and foraging. If disaster struck, they could move on, and when finding another henge or teepee, could set up pretty quickly. It was during this period that some decided to stay and set up what would become villages. As developments continued, those who remained got back into farming, and this time it flourished. The fundamental beliefs of interconnectedness, all things having spirit, and the egalitarian ethos began to develop further at this stage, due to a more sedentary life, and they had more time on their hands. The ones who know became priests and kings in some instances, and whatever was the local resource often featured as the god of that belief system. This was the evolution of faith of civilized life. The hunter-gatherers were still doing their thing, but many were settling now instead. So there were two schools of thought, the traditional wanderers and those who settled. These two groups were fine at first, but gradually the civilized people began to encourage the wanderers to live in the villages and towns. As religion emerged with civilization, the hunter-gatherers who continued wandering kept their traditions. Now, inasmuch as the traditional hunter-gatherers continued in their way, some realized that they could have the best of both worlds and thus became pastoralists, herders and shepherds. This was almost like a compromise for them. The change to more sedentary life brought more free time and opportunity to think. Civilization thrived bringing about religion, but herders continued in their traditions. However, their pastoral ways brought about a sort of hunter's code, which I covered in a previous articles, the forest sages and abundance and survival. This code basically said, no young, no mothers, not too much, and this remained as they managed the herds, keeping to the egalitarian ethos, whilst retaining the ideas of interconnectedness and all things having spirit. I'm not going to explore the civilized route, as the focus of this piece is on the hunter-gatherers. As pastoralists, their philosophy began to develop and the resource of the forests kept calling to them, becoming places of abundance and contemplation. This happened predominantly in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iran and the Indias. We tend to know of the forest sages of India, but seldom of the proto-Zoroastrian ones in Iran, which is why I write this. There came a time where some yearned for yesterday, and a trend emerged whereby individuals would go and reflect on the old life in the forests. As philosophy grew, so did the number of sages. There came a stage where what would eventually become a divergent path for both trains of spiritual paths looked back to understand the roots of their origins. One path was the proto-Zoroastrians of the West, the other being the Vedic path in the East. Both paths retained the original understanding, but had a difference of opinion on how the faith would progress. This is explained in the previous article and episode, including the forest sages. However, the theology that was emerging needed answers, so naturally they went to the sages and gurus who resided in the forests for the answers, which were transplanted into the nascent religions. Problems arose though, and the evolution of faith had to solve these problems. What is the way? Is there an escape from it? If there is, then how? Is the cosmos directly involved in the process? These questions were eventually discerned and chart the progress of religion. There's the way. Yes. There's liberation, forgiveness and reconciliation. Yes. The creator is directly involved. It charts the course of how new religions formed. Taoism, Abrahamic and Vedic faiths, Buddhism, then Christianity, Islam. This was what happened and how religion emerged. There is no bias, but you will discover, as I did, that the original beliefs directly relate to what Christ taught to the followers of the way that formed some 2,000 years ago. The spirit of egalitarianism is core to this, just as much as interconnectedness and everything having a spirit. Many tribes that exist now still exhibit these traits, alongside a strong survival instinct, which at times it seems contrary to the other beliefs. It's similar, in part, to understanding the difference between God in the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, a perception of God is one who can be fierce and leads people through wars, whereas the New Testament shows a more loving and forgiving God. In this somewhat contrary manner, ancient beliefs display the original attributes of faith yet also have survival mentality, and this is due to the rise of religion itself. Consider the effect missionaries have had on the South Americas, where conversions also brought about new illnesses and the conquest of lands. It's for this reason that the defensive and survival mode is activated. A modern example would be the Sentinel Island tribes, who are vehemently opposed to any interference and visit, claiming that they will unalive anyone who attempts to visit them. And this is why, with anything like this, I always maintain, leave them alone. This survival mode that is often exhibited as defensiveness, embraces the very human side of vulnerability, as opposed to the ready preparedness that happens with abundance. The equality that emerged in the minds of hunter-gatherers is also down to this abundance, with a cautious eye to survive against animals and humans. It was like they had a corporate mindset, where everything is for everyone, freedom of movement, sharing and caring with others, which is contrasted to the civil equivalent of storing up for ourselves. The egalitarian nature is what transitions well from early hunter-gatherers, setting the scene for moral and meditative practices. As the transformation occurs whereby they become pastoralists, shepherds, etc., one wonders what the herder did whilst tending the flock. The primary duty is to protect the animals and lead them to pastures and areas good for grazing, so the natural process helped manage the environment as well. The interconnectedness here shows how keeping of meadows and grasses manageable ties in with the nature of herding. Whilst the animals are dining, the herder protects and has plenty of time to contemplate and meditate. Especially in the Hyrcanian forests of northern Iran, herders moved throughout the forests and steppes, guiding the flock and contemplating everything, as if it's their idiosyncrasy. So it's no wonder that the sages and gurus went to the forests to find illumination, following in their ancestors' footsteps, quite literally in some cases. It was a practical application of pastoral behavior to manage the environment, as well as enabling a contemplative mindset. The spirit of this then forms the basis of later esoteric knowledge, with civilizations' religions also dipping in to find the answers from their roots. The only problem that proved challenging to the collective wandering hunter-gatherers was the changing landscapes. On the journeys to and fro, occasionally the land would change due to flooding, earthquake or volcanic activity. When this occurred, some believers would have been cut off from the main group, so the development of these can delay the psychology of the belief, which accounts for some differences of belief in various parts of the world. The best example is with Australasia. The loss of Sunderland cut a lot off from the roots stemming from mainland China. We know people from the Indias traveled this far and the origins of Australian Aboriginal thought stayed at a particular point and didn't expand. Essentially, the Aboriginal ways and beliefs are the same as other tribes, but the spiritual development became arrested due to being cut off. As they could not move back and forth to India, China as easily, the beliefs encountered less syncresis. If one looks carefully at the idea of the dreaming and Vishnu's dream creation narrative, they appear similar in essence, but the development of Vishnu's dream develops and evolves to understand time and calendars. The Aboriginal dreaming, in direct contrast to this, remains with the notion that everything everywhere is happening at once. Another contrast is the idea of other realms, like heaven. The Indians have these concepts but the Aboriginal do not, for again, everything that exists is already living amongst us and is here already. There's not many places, just the one. The Aboriginal version echoes the earliest philosophy of hunter-gathering, but gets arrested. Just as the Middle Eastern system of belief differs from the Indian, so too does the Aboriginal. Each of these demonstrates the progress of the spiritual evolution, Aborigine being first per second stage, Iranian being third and Indian being fourth. The Indian philosophy goes on to encompass astronomy and mathematics. The Aboriginal philosophy stays as is and the Iranian leads to the Abrahamic faiths. In the Northern Hemisphere, development occurs later post-Ice Age, and in the Americas, Aboriginal thought gets the chance to expand with the Amerindians and it does, maintaining the hunter-gatherer's ethos of interconnectedness, all things having spirit and egalitarianism. But they evolve a stage further to understand that there's also a great spirit. Although these four paths seem divergent, their respective paths stem from the three original, integral ideas. Now we get to the scriptures. In previous articles I've explained how the us in Genesis 1 is referring to the forest sages, as well as being a direct reference to God. Later on in the passage, it explains how these aspects of interconnectedness, spirit and egalitarianism are in fact our remit. God creates us so, they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock. This is the environmental management. Then God says, everything that has the breath of life in it, this is all things having spirit, and that God himself, breath, life into it. God is very present in these acts, being right at the heart of it all, displaying the interconnectedness of all things. It's all there in the Babylonian-inspired part of the Genesis text. Later in Genesis 2, where the Hebrew version starts, God says that he placed us in the Garden of Eden, to work it and take care of it, reinforcing this idea. As we do this, we start naming the animals, indicating that we begin to communicate in some way. In Genesis 3, we see that the knowledge of good and evil is established and that Eve takes asterisk, which is very telling, as there's now a difference between having and taking. It's this point that indicates a change of mindset. Next, people are cast out and things change significantly, keeping some from going back west, a blockage of some kind. So hopefully you can see how the four paths, Iranian, Indian, Aboriginal Northern Europe, of spiritual divergence emerge with the core fundamental principles, yet have one common core. These early beliefs grew and changed, except where something stops them from moving. The Amerindian and Iranian roots flourished into established pathways of faith, as did the Indian, but the Aboriginal got arrested. In this way, it demonstrates the growth and evolution of spirituality. This is what we believed and it flowed through too, now. Those first beliefs are still there with hunter-gatherers today, whereas religions are the evolved thoughts of civilized life, but they still required the origins of their beliefs, where the forests united us all. And it's amazing to think that thousands of years later, civilized thought, through science, came to understand aspects of quantum physics that takes us back to our very first beliefs on the nature of being and how everything is interconnected. The very spirit of this is still preserved and very much present, calling us to be managers of the environment, be fair, as in egalitarian, and to be custodians of these beliefs.